Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are because I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and we're finally riding the Gettysburg Express. Yeah! Almost nailed it. All right, have fun, guys. All right, and so when I first started the Poe Chronicles, I didn't appreciate how big and all encompassing this story would become. I didn't understand how deeply rooted the Poe branch of the Mud City Paradigm puzzle tree really was, or is. Right? It goes pretty deep, which kind of surprised me actually, because while Poe is intimately connected to Baltimore via his work and his mysterious death, right, he wasn't a Baltimore native, or a Maryland native for that matter, being raised by the Virginian John Allen, right? And the modern mainstream historical narrative sort of paints it like Poe's time in Baltimore is circumstantial. Like it's tied more to his work than anything, or perhaps his lack thereof. You know, though he does have family here, I'm certain if he found a successful writing gig in Philadelphia or Boston or anywhere else, he wouldn't have been in Baltimore. Right? At least that's what the type of character that they paint Poe as. Right? He was definitely hungry for success. And so maybe it's because of this reason I never actually really thought of Poe's being from Baltimore or his family being from Baltimore. It was really kind of surprising when I found, Mary Phillips' 1926 biography, and then of course Bewley's 1906 biography come genealogy, right? That kind of sort of blew that notion right out of the water, right? Poe's family is definitely connected to deeply to the history of Baltimore and the settling of Maryland and so forth by association through the families and who they knew. And that's something I hope will come across lucidly enough as I present this, right? Because it's time to take this paradigm shifting story of the Poe family away from England, right? And away from Sherwood Forest and the Byrons and the Disneys, right, among others, and away from Dr. Leonard Poe, prominent member of the royal court for well over 30 years, over the reigns of 3 different monarchs, right? And he makes that transition from the Tudor dynasty to the first 2 monarchs of the Stuart dynasty. I mean, his presence is in the court for a long time. For a long time. All right, and so it's time to move away from Lenny Poe of the royal court, who most assuredly knew these 2 footnotes of history. Right? Francis, I did everything bacon, right? And John Merlin D. Right? Absolutely chums with these guys, right? He knew these people, right? And so he also would have had really intimate knowledge of what was happening with the plantation of Ulster through his benefactor, Robert Devereux, the 2nd Earl of Essex, whose father had successfully campaigned over in Ulster, right? Right? But he also would have had intimate knowledge of what was happening with the plantation of America. With his ties to these 3 jokers here, right? The ones the narrative tells us were responsible for what was happening over here across the pond. Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh and John Smith, right? All our heroes of Elizabethan exploration, right? But it's time to get away. It's time to move this Poe family over to Ireland, right? But before we say goodbye to Lenny, and Lenny, I miss you already. I really do, right? Lenny needs to say hello and goodbye to, who knows, maybe it could have been his best friend in the royal court of the Elizabethan era, right? And that would be one Georgie Boy Calvert. Right? Without a doubt, these 2 fellas knew each other. And so I'm thinking it's all this courtside intel that truly informs the Poe family movements over from England to Ireland and then ultimately to America. Right? It has to be. There can be no coincidence, because we have to remember that, George Calvert, the barony of Baltimore, comes out of the County Longford in Ireland, which is the heart, right in the heart of Carroll country. All right, and we're going to get more into this as we go. All right, and so now I don't think it's any coincidence that it's Dr. Leonard Poe's young cousins, his first cousins, the brothers Poe, William, Thomas, and little Anthony Poe, who were sons of his uncle, Anthony Poe. Remember him? Right? He was the tenant farmer on the manor of Papelwick, Lord Byron's estate, right? So it's his sons, right? They're the ones that answer the call of the Stuarts to go settle Ulster, right? They want to scoop up some of those generous land grants that the kings are handing out, and they go over there. But the thing about it is, a lot of the land grants that the Stuarts are giving out just so happen to be very closely associated to Carroll land, right? And again, the Carrolls were essentially awarded all of this land in Maryland here as sort of compensation, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about that coming up as well, right? But again, I don't think it's a coincidence that it's this Anthony Poe's kids or Leonard Poe's cousins, right? They have inside information, or they are working. So the way I see it is the Poes are really sort of operating either with this intel from the royal court or from within it, like they're actually like agents of the crown or otherwise. Again, there's something really crazy about the way this all plays out for me. And so when I first put this together, I was really hoping I could kind of just sort of hop, skip, and jump over William Thomas and Little Antony, right? But it turns out that once I started to connect them to the land and then to the Carrolls and everything, it really started to get deep with the complete ancient history of Ireland and the mythology and everything like that. And I realized I was going to have to sort of do multiple videos to try to really tie it together, because it really did become this journey through the entire history of Ireland, right? And how intimately connected the Celtic mythology of ancient Ireland is to the plantation of Ulster, right? And how intimately connected the plantation of Ulster is to the American Revolution. Something that I've touched on early in my show, and it's a theme that keeps worming its way back in, most recently through the Sussex Declaration, right? And, it was here that, I knew I was going to have to do a multiple part video, and I realized that maybe perhaps the story would be better served by establishing some context, building the story backwards, so to speak, right? And hopefully highlighting how all these coincidences aren't really coincidences at all, but synchronicities. And while technically the story of how the Poes came to America does begin with the brothers Poe, and so we're going to skip ahead about 100 years. And so we're going to pick it up with David Poe of Dring, right? He of the chicken-legged County Cavan, right? Right? Who I have as David Bowie here, right? All right, because he is Edgar Allan Poe's great-great-grandfather. Because it's his children that settle over in America, right? Alexander and John, right? And, John being Edgar's great-grandfather, right? And I never realized that Aleister Crowley's given name was Alexander right before this, but it was Alexander who comes over here first, right? And this is from David Poe of Dring's will, right? To his elder son Alexander, who came to America about 1739 and settled and improved lands in the Manor of Mask, Marsh Creek, Pennsylvania. Right? He left him £5, right? But which he could only claim if he gave up his stake in America and moved back to Ireland, which I think is kind of interesting. All right, but he's the first one to come over, and his brother John follows him in a few years. All right, so now when I saw he was Manor of Mask, Marsh Creek, Pennsylvania, I had to find out, well, where is that? What is that? Right? So what Marsh Creek, Pennsylvania is, right, it's Gettysburg. Right? And not just the city of Gettysburg, but the actual land of the battlefield. Right? The location of the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. I think that's what our history tells us. I know I could be wrong about that. But, when I first found that out, I was like, are you kidding me that I could tie Edgar Allan, with all the other things that I could tie to Edgar Allan Poe, I could now tie the Battle of Gettysburg directly to Edgar Allan Poe through his great-grandfather, John. I was like, this is insane, the way Poe is connecting to all of these elements. And so here we go with the Manor of Mask, right? And it says here that the Manor of Mask was surveyed in 1766, named for an estate in England. And believe me, I went looking for that estate, and as I always say, there's only so much I'm willing to do. But as far as these things go for me, I looked pretty hard to try to find this estate in England, and I couldn't do it. But right, it says the manor was about 6 miles wide and 12 miles long, with the southern boundary at present Mason-Dixon line. It was the second largest reserved estate of the Penns in Pennsylvania, right? And that marker marks the eastern boundary line, or somewhere close to it, right? And but one thing I think is a really important aspect of the story here is perhaps Gettysburg and the Manor of Mask's location to the 40th parallel. Because one element here, and this is what I think is really amazing, is that this Manor of Mask and Gettysburg fall right in the middle of the Penn-Calvert border dispute, right? And again, this is something that I just touched on very briefly early in my show when I was trying to find out, who the Lords Baltimore were. And so the short of it is that, Charles II wasn't really paying attention to minor contrivances like borders when he granted William Penn the land that became Pennsylvania. And you have to remember that Maryland and later Pennsylvania, they were no mere colonies founded by trading companies, right? I mean, they were proprietary. Essentially, they were tiny mini kingdoms of the Penn and Calvert families, and that they paid tribute to the crown. And I believe Maryland's tribute was 2 arrows from the Algonquin tribe. I wonder if they still have to pay that one or not, right? And so whether it was accidental or on purpose, in 1681, Charles II grants William Penn the land that becomes Pennsylvania. They call it Penna at the time. In the grant, he actually grants Penn land that had already belonged to the Calverts, right? Because the Calverts knew that the charter that was granted to them by King James, which was ratified by Charles I after James I's death, gave them land to the north to the 40th parallel, which is marked here. All right. And so when the Calverts heard that Charles II was going to grant William Penn all this land, they really had no problem with it as long as the Penns stayed north of the 40th parallel. Right. But the problem begins with the inscrutable William Penn, right? And he negotiates a charter that he believes extends as far south as the 38th parallel, which is here. And if that were to hold true, the land that is Washington, D.C. would have been William Penn territory. And I think this is really kind of interesting given the real estate, the places that are within this stretch here, and that these border disputes were as intense as they were and lasted as long as they did. I mean, this thing goes on for 80 years. Right? All right, so when the Calverts got wind of this, they weren't happy about it, right? But another problem was that William Penn just so happened to be Charles II's boy, right? I mean, they were tight, and we're going to get into that a little bit further down the line. But they were super tight, and so he, of course, being the king, he really couldn't admit his mistake or anything. So he kind of left it to the two families to sort of battle it out as to what the boundaries were going to be, and it really started to come to a head around the time when William Penn started to found and build up Philadelphia, which was below the 40th parallel, which the Calverts believed was their land, right? And think about that. The importance of Philadelphia, at one time being under Calvert jurisdiction, in the earliest days of the colonies. That's a sort of very interesting connection to make. All right, so as I was saying, he kind of lets the families work it out. They sue each other. There's court battles. There's actual battles, right? Because, there's definitely bloodshed along the way, right? But it was finally resolved by the creation of the Mason-Dixon line in 1763. Like I was saying, it was like some 80 years after this land dispute begins, right? And, the Calverts really kind of, in the end, depending on how you want to look at it, sort of come out the losers in this sort of deal, But did they really, because they did have access to this land, and who knows, maybe they could have just been done with it anyway. They didn't need it anymore, Screw Pennsylvania. And let's see. All right, because one other thing about this Manor of Mask, right, Marsh Creek, it's not only Gettysburg, right? It's not also called the Manor of Mask, right? But it just so happens to be on Carroll land. Right? In 1732, Charles Carroll of Maryland received a grant of 5,000 acres of land in present Adams County, Pennsylvania. Right? Soon after, a survey of that land, known as Carroll's Tract or Carroll's Delight, was conducted. Right? 5,000 acres, right? And so it's this Adams County, that's the present county where Gettysburg is located today. Okay, and so it says here about the settlement of Adams County, right? It said it occurred before the treaty with the natives ceding it, right? And they were part of this called this Blunston licenses. And, hopefully I'll get to that a little bit further down the line. They first started being issued in 1734. Right? And so now remember, it was 1732 that the Carrolls got their 5,000 acre grant there. Right? And it says in 1736, the Penns purchased all the region lying west of the lower Susquehanna from the Indians. And so now, did he really purchase this land from the Indians, or maybe did he purchase it from Charles Carroll? I don't know. That's a question that has to be raised when looking at these dates the way they are, and the way the saga of this Manor of Mask sort of plays out, right? Just to highlight the tenseness of the situation, right? It says here in 1729, which is 3 years before the Calvert Carroll deal, right? The settlers, in quotes, who were really just a little more than squatters, right? It even says so, right? They squatted. You know, as early as 1729, they were asking the Penns for military help against the invading Marylanders, right? But it wasn't until 1740 that the Penns call that area the Manor of Mask, which is some 26 years before it's officially surveyed, right? The sign at the beginning of this says 1766 it was surveyed, right? And the interesting thing about the manor is it says here that manors were not new to the Penns, right? Because the practice of mannerism, right, was resurrected, and I think that's an interesting choice of words, right? It was resurrected by the crown just for William Penn, some 300 years after the last grant of a manor in England, right? That's amazing, right? And I need to look more into that, because it says here that the Manor of Mask is only one of 44 manors in Pennsylvania, right? And these manors are huge. Like I said, Manor of Mask was 6 miles by 12 miles. That's a big chunk of land, right? But getting back to the land dispute, I think this is kind of really interesting because depending on where you migrated from, that could tie directly into your loyalties, right? If you purchased land or were given land in that region from William Penn, chances are you were English. But if you're a young Alexander Poe here, right, coming over from Ireland, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that he thinks he's settling on Calvert Carroll land. All right, because take a look at this, right? This is a blow up of the Manor of Mask, and we have this little plot of land here called Tyrone. You don't think Alexander Poe ended up there, do you? Right? No, of course not. Right? I bet he did, right? And, so it's from here. And so again, I don't think these are coincidences. This is now building synchronicities, especially when I look at this American Ulster plantation project through the prism of the Red Hand of Ulster, right? Which is intimately connected to the Poe family and the places in Ulster they end up settling in, right? The Red Hand may also be an indicator of the Poe family possibly being a hidden guiding hand, or perhaps a secret noble bloodline, right? With their connections not only to the crown, but to the Carrolls as well, right? Especially with the way this whole staging of the American Revolution through Baltimore storyline is presenting itself. Because let's not forget the importance the Red Hand may be playing in our modern political theater with President Biden's family ties to Londonderry and Ulster, not to mention his Catholicism, right? Or the Jesuit Catholic chair of the Federal Reserve, who is so Roman his first name actually has Rome in it, right? There it is. That's unbelievable, right? And whose family name of Powell, as Bewley asserts, is the root of the Poe family name, right? So the synchronicities just keep piling up, right? Because springboarding from the Manor of Mask, John Poe, right, moves to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where he raises his son, right? David Poe Sr., right? The general, right? The super patriot, right? He of the spinning wheel and clockworks fame, right? And grandfather of Edgar Allan Poe, right? And so to me, it seems a certainty that David Poe Sr. knew and was friendly with these two cats, right? Tyrone County transplant John Dunlap, right, who may or may not have been on a mission from God when he printed the Dunlap broadside copies of the Declaration of Independence, right? But also David Rittenhouse, right, astronomer, inventor, and all-around polymath who may have commissioned gearworks from David Poe for his orreries. And it's also fairly safe to assume that Rittenhouse, Knight of the House, knew and did business with John Dunlap because before the broadsides, Dunlap was an early publisher of American newspapers, right? And it was Rittenhouse's family that opened the first paper mill on American soil, perhaps supplying Dunlap with the paper for his newspapers, right? Who knows? And so, of course, it's also a safe bet that David Poe Sr. was extremely close with the Carrolls, right? There's no doubt about it, right? And so it's amidst this backdrop of location and personal connections that David Poe Sr.'s son, right, the disposable David Poe Jr., right,
The actor?
decides to betray his family's wishes for him to become a lawyer, and he follows his heart and his loins to run away and join a traveling theater group, right? To follow his dreams and be with the love of his life, Eliza Arnold Hopkins, right? But theirs is a story for another day, because before I close this one out, I just want to say something about David Poe Sr.'s wife, Edgar Allan Poe's grandmother. Here, the beautiful Miss Elizabeth Kearns of dark-eyed Irish ancestry. because even this brief description of her could betray a deeper significance to this story, not only with her dark-eyed ancestry, but also with her family name of Carnes. Because although in my brief search through her family, which yielded nothing, I did learn that the name Carnes means a mound of rough stones built as a memorial or a landmark. I mean, look at some of these, right? Especially these two here, right? These are unbelievable. All right, so we're just going to put these in our back pocket for now and see if they have any meaning further on down the road, because I'm getting ready to wrap this one up here. And before I go, I just want to mention a few things. And first is that when I was doing my initial rabbit holing on this one, I did an accidental Google search for a mask of land, right? Confusing mask for manor. And so it says here that land masks are used for concealing the land of the northern and southern hemispheres, or, pretty much the whole globe, right? I mean, there are only two hemispheres. And so it says that land masks can conceal land before the data is processed. And so when I clicked on this link, it brought me here to this NASA webpage about polar stereographic data, where it says that masks and overlays supply the user many options for concealing unwanted regions or overlaying coastlines, right? It goes on to say that slight differences in grid pixels masked as land can introduce discrepancies. Contamination of ocean coastal pixels happens depending on their proximity to land, which produces false ice concentration values. Right, so I don't know about you, but that sounds like it could be a real problem, right? But perhaps not as big a problem as trusting the sources that tell us what our realm looks like, or where things are located. We have no idea how accurate or inaccurate these satellite image maps are, or ancient maps for that reason, or even the Rand McNally atlases that we have today, right? So much of this information we take for granted. I think it's something that we as alternative paradigm researchers really need to be aware of. Our realm may not be what they show us. Right? And so, I mean, there's that to chew on, but I also want to say again how absolutely amazing it is that this Poe branch of the Mud City Paradigm puzzle tree can connect to current events. I mean, here with the use of masks, from Alexander Payton to the Penns and their mask of land, to Poe and his mask of the Red Death, and COVID and its magical face coverings, and all the way to NASA and its digital masks and overlays, right? This story just keeps getting better, right? And so to close this chapter out with one thought that probably doesn't mean anything but is awfully fun to speculate on, is that filtering this story through the prism of false history, maybe it's no coincidence that the Poes landed in Gettysburg, right? Because if you're invested at all in the idea that the Civil War wasn't what we are told it was, and you couple that with all the mythologizing that has gone on around it, not only the battle itself, but with who the president was at the time, right? And the things that he said there, I think it becomes a little easier to see the influence the Poe family, along with their friends, the Disneys of Lincolnshire, right? It gets easier to see the influence these families may have had on the paradigm as it's presented to us today, right? So, okay, guys, that's all I have for this one. I hope you guys had fun watching this one, and I had a whole lot of fun putting it together for you guys. And remember, just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies. All right, until the next one, cheers.